The morning sun hadn't yet peeked over the horizon when Nina woke up. Her small alarm clock showed 4:30 a.m., the same time she'd been waking up for almost 15 years now. She moved quietly through her tiny apartment, careful not to wake her elderly mother who slept in the bedroom while Nina took the pull-out couch in the living room. Their arrangement wasn't ideal, but it was all they could afford on her cleaning salary. Nina splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. At 56, the lines around her eyes had deepened, and strands of gray now outnumbered the dark brown in her hair. Her hands, once smooth and graceful, had grown rough from years of scrubbing floors, polishing furniture, and handling harsh cleaning chemicals at the Grand Hotel. She made herself a simple breakfast, toast and tea, eating in the dim light of the kitchen while mentally preparing for the day ahead. Friday meant the main lobby and lounge would need extra attention. The weekend brought more guests, more mess, more work. Nina didn't mind. The routine of it all was comforting in its predictability. By 5:15, she was dressed in her gray uniform with the hotel logo stitched above the pocket, her hair pulled back in a practical bun. She packed a small lunch, kissed her sleeping mother's forehead, and stepped out into the still dark morning. The 20-minute walk to the hotel was her favorite part of the day. The quiet streets, the gradual awakening of the city, the time alone with her thoughts. The Grand Hotel stood like a palace against the lightening sky, its elegant facade illuminated by tasteful exterior lighting. Built in the 1920s, it had maintained its classic charm through careful renovations that preserved its character, while adding modern luxuries. For the wealthy who stayed there, it was a brief, pleasant experience. For Nina, it was a world she moved through but never truly belonged to. "Morning, Nina," called the night security guard as she entered through the staff entrance at the back of the building. Tom was one of the few employees who consistently acknowledged her presence. He was retiring next month after 20 years at the hotel. Nina would miss their brief morning exchanges. "Morning, Tom. Quiet night. As at church." Though the Baldwin party and the royal suite ordered champagne at 3 in the morning. "These rich folks sure know how to party." He chuckled, signing her in on his clipboard. Nina nodded with a polite smile as she headed to the small staff room to store her coat and bag. The room was empty this early. The other cleaning staff wouldn't arrive for another hour. Nina preferred it this way. She could start her rounds in peace, without the supervisor breathing down her neck or coworkers asking for help with their assignments. She gathered her supplies, the cleaning cart stocked with sprays, cloths, dusters, and trash bags. Every item had its place, organized just the way she liked it. After 15 years, Nina could practically clean the hotel blindfolded. She knew every corner, every surface, every hidden spot where dust collected. The main lobby was first on her list today. With its soaring ceilings, marble floors, and crystal chandeliers, it was the hotel's crown jewel. Guests formed their first impressions here, and management insisted it sparkle at all times. Nina worked methodically, starting with dusting the high moldings using her extendable duster, then working her way down to the furniture, the reception desk, carefully navigating around the night clerk who barely glanced up from his computer, and finally the floors. By 7 a.m., she'd moved on to the main lounge. This elegant room, with its plush velvet chairs and ornate fireplace, was where guests gathered for afternoon tea or evening drinks. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city park across the street, and artwork worth more than Nina would earn in a lifetime hung on deep burgundy walls. And then there was the piano. A magnificent grand piano stood on a slightly raised platform in the corner of the lounge. Its polished black surface gleamed under the soft lighting, giving no hint of the problems within. Nina approached it with reverence as she did every morning, carefully dusting its surface with a soft cloth. She knew every inch of this instrument, had watched countless pianists perform on it over the years, some talented, others merely adequate, most playing background music that the hotel guests largely ignored. For the past few months, the piano had stood silent. Nina had overheard Mr. Peterson, the hotel manager, explaining to guests that it had developed some issues with the hammers and strings. "We're waiting for a specialist to come from Europe," he'd say with importance. "This isn't just any piano, you know. It's a handcrafted Steinway from 1910. Nina knew the piano wasn't actually broken beyond use. Certainly some notes didn't ring true, and a few keys stuck if pressed too firmly, but in capable hands it could still sing. She glanced around the empty lounge, listening for approaching footsteps. Hearing none, she set down her cleaning cloth and carefully, silently lifted the fallboard that covered the keys. The ivory and ebony keys beckoned to her, old friends she rarely got to greet properly. Nina's fingers hovered over them, not quite touching. She could feel the pull, the desire to press down, to release the music that lived inside both the piano and herself. But she knew better. Once, years ago, a supervisor had caught her playing a simple melody and had threatened to fire her. "You're paid to clean the piano, not play it," he'd sneered. So Nina had learned to play in silence. As she dusted each day, her mind would run through scales, arpeggios, and pieces she had once known by heart. Her fingers would twitch slightly, muscle memory still strong despite the years of disuse. Sometimes, when alone, she would mime playing over the closed cover, her hands remembering what it felt like to dance across the keys and create something beautiful. With a small sigh, Nina gently closed the fallboard and returned to her dusting. The lounge would soon fill with early risers wanting coffee and breakfast. She needed to finish her cleaning before they arrived. "Talking to the piano again, Nina?" The voice startled her. It was Delia, one of the breakfast servers arriving to set up the coffee station in the corner of the lounge. "Just cleaning," Nina replied, forcing a smile. Delia was nice enough but loved to chat, which could slow down Nina's carefully planned schedule. "You always look at that thing like it's your long-lost love," Delia teased as she arranged cups and saucers on a tray. "I swear you give it more attention than my husband gives me, and we're newlyweds." Nina shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation. "It's a beautiful instrument. Deserves proper care." "Well, you'd think they'd fix it already. What's the point of a fancy piano nobody can play?" Delia shook her head. "Heard there's some big shot composer staying here this weekend. Bunch of music people coming for his birthday or something. Maybe they'll finally get it tuned up." Nina's heart skipped a beat. A composer? Music people? She wanted to ask more but held back, not wanting to appear too interested. Instead, she nodded and moved on to cleaning the end tables and lamps, but her mind was racing. Which composer? What kind of music? Would there be performances? As the morning progressed and the hotel came fully to life, Nina continued her work, invisible to most of the guests who passed by. She cleaned around a businessman typing furiously on his laptop, ducked past a couple arguing in hushed tones about their itinerary, and waited patiently while a group of tourists decided whether to have breakfast in the lounge or venture out to explore local cafes. During her brief lunch break, eaten quickly in the staff room, Nina overheard more about the weekend event. The composer was Alexander Vetrov, apparently famous for his film scores and orchestral works. The hotel would host a private party for him on Saturday evening, with many distinguished musicians expected to attend. Nina had never heard of Vetrov, but that wasn't surprising. Her knowledge of contemporary classical music had faded over the years, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Once she had devoured music journals and attended every concert she could afford. Now her world had narrowed to work, home caring for her mother, and the occasional classical radio program she'd listened to while cooking dinner. As she finished her shift late that afternoon, Nina found herself lingering in the lounge, taking extra time to polish the wood panels near the piano. The room was temporarily empty, the lull before evening activities would begin. On impulse, she approached the piano again. This time she allowed herself to lift the fallboard and very gently press one key, middle C, without producing a sound. The feeling of the cool ivory beneath her fingertips sent a shiver through her body, awakening memories she usually kept carefully locked away. Nina quickly closed the piano and gathered her cleaning supplies. As she pushed her cart toward the staff area, she passed Mr. Peterson speaking with a woman in an expensive-looking business suit, likely planning details for the weekend event. Neither of them glanced her way. In their eyes, she was just part of the hotel's machinery, necessary but unremarkable, like the plumbing or electrical systems. Walking home in the early evening light, Nina found herself humming softly, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece she once played at her final conservatory recital. For just a moment, she allowed herself to remember who she had been before the war in her homeland, before the economic collapse, before fleeing to this country with nothing but her mother and a single suitcase, before the years of invisible labor. By the time she reached her apartment, the melody had faded, replaced by thoughts of dinner, laundry, and preparing for tomorrow. But something had awakened inside her, something that had been dormant for too long. As she turned her key in the lock, Nina wondered what it would feel like to play again, really play, to lose herself in music and feel truly alive, if only for a moment. Saturday arrived with a flurry of activity at the Grand Hotel. Nina had been asked to work an unusual shift, coming in at her regular early morning time, but staying until late evening to help with the special event. The extra hours meant additional pay, which she desperately needed for her mother's medication, so she had agreed without hesitation. By midday, the hotel had transformed. Nina watched from the sidelines as an army of staff rolled out plush red carpets, arranged elaborate flower displays, and transformed the main lounge and adjacent ballroom into a setting worthy of royalty. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandeliers, each one polished to perfection by Nina and the other cleaning staff earlier that morning. White-jacketed waiters practiced their synchronized movements, balancing trays of empty glasses in preparation for the champagne service later. "Make sure you stay invisible tonight," Mrs. Rodriguez, the head of housekeeping, reminded the cleaning team during their briefing. "These are important people, musicians, critics, wealthy patrons. They should never see you working. If something spills, wait until they move away before cleaning it. If a bathroom needs attention, wait until it's empty. Understand?" Everyone nodded. They were used to being invisible. It was part of the job description. "Nina, you'll be on standby in the service corridor near the lounge," Mrs. Rodriguez continued. "We expect the highest level of discretion." The pause and pointed look made it clear. Nina was being assigned this spot because she was older, more experienced, and less likely to gawk at the famous guests than some of the younger staff. As afternoon faded into evening, Nina caught glimpses of the guest of honor, Alexander Vetrov, as he briefly toured the space with Mr. Peterson. Vetrov was shorter than she'd expected, with a head of wild silver hair and bushy eyebrows that seemed to have a life of their own. He gestured dramatically as he spoke, his accented English carrying through the room. Nina strained to hear, pretending to dust the same lamp for the third time. "The acoustics in here are quite good," Vetrov was saying, his eyes scanning the lounge. "A shame about the piano. I would have enjoyed playing a little something for my friends." "Yes, such a pity," Mr. Peterson agreed with exaggerated disappointment. "The specialist from Vienna can't come until next month. But we have arranged for recorded music and the string quartet will arrive at 8. Nina felt a pang of sadness. If only they knew the piano wasn't completely broken. In the right hands, gentle, knowing hands, it could still produce beautiful music despite its imperfections. Like people, she thought, instruments sometimes just needed someone who understood their quirks and limitations. By 7 o'clock, guests began arriving. Nina watched from her post in the service corridor, door cracked open just enough to see into the lounge. The women wore dresses that cost more than she earned in a year, dripping with jewels that caught the light as they moved. The men were in tuxedos, some traditional black, others in more flamboyant colors that marked them as artists rather than businessmen. They air-kissed each other's cheeks, laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, and spoke with their hands as much as their voices. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played in the corner, not on the piano platform, Nina noticed, but arranged in a semicircle near the windows. Their music was technically perfect, but somehow lifeless. Background noise rather than art. Most guests paid them no attention, too busy with their networking and socializing. As the evening progressed, Nina was called out occasionally to handle small emergencies. A spilled drink here, a smudge on a mirror there. Each time she slipped in and out of the room like a shadow, eyes downcast, movements efficient. No one thanked her. Few even noticed her presence. Around 9:30, one of the bathroom sinks overflowed, requiring Nina's attention. As she finished mopping up the water and was gathering her supplies, she heard raised voices from the lounge, Vetrov making a speech, guests applauding and cheering. She hurried to finish, not wanting Mrs. Rodriguez to come looking for her. When Nina returned to the lounge, the atmosphere had changed. The quartet had taken a break, and the recorded music playing softly through the speakers was drowned out by louder conversations. More empty champagne bottles stood on the bar. Faces were flushed, voices louder, laughter more frequent. The party had reached that tipping point where inhibition started to fade and behavior became less restrained. Nina spotted a tray of empty glasses abandoned on a side table near the piano. She approached cautiously, glancing around to make sure she wasn't interrupting any important conversations. As she carefully placed each glass on her tray, she couldn't help but look longingly at the piano. The fallboard was open tonight, the keys exposed as if inviting someone to play. She wondered if Vetrov had asked to examine it earlier. "Hey, look at how she's staring at that piano," a male voice said loudly from nearby, like a kid at a candy store window. Nina startled, nearly dropping a glass. She hadn't realized anyone was watching her. A group of 5 or 6 people stood a few feet away, drinks in hand, amused expressions on their faces. They were younger than most of the other guests, probably in their 30s, dressed expensively but with an edgier style that suggested they were musicians or industry people, rather than wealthy patrons. "I'm sorry," Nina mumbled, keeping her eyes down as she had been trained to do. "I'll be out of your way in a moment." "No, wait," said a woman with short platinum hair and a black jumpsuit. "Do you play? You were looking at it like you wanted to sit down and start playing." Nina shook her head quickly, gathering the last of the glasses. No, I just clean here." "Oh, come on," said the first man, his words slightly slurred. He was tall and thin, with a carefully trimmed beard and a velvet jacket in deep burgundy. "Everyone plays a little something. Even the cleaning lady must know chopsticks or heart and soul, right?" His friends laughed and Nina felt her cheeks burn. She tried to move away, but the man stepped closer. "I bet she's secretly a virtuoso," he continued, clearly entertaining his friends at her expense. "A hidden talent, scrubbing toilets by day, performing concertos by night." More laughter. Nina clutched the tray of glasses tightly, wishing she could disappear. "Anton, stop being a jerk," said another woman in the group, though she was smiling as she said it. "I'm not being a jerk. I'm being inclusive," Anton protested with mock innocence. "Everyone else here has had a chance to show off tonight. Liam played his new piece you sang, Vetrov conducted the quartet with a breadstick. Why not let the cleaning staff have a turn?" Before Nina could respond, another man from the group, shorter, with glasses and a bow tie that looked slightly askew, jumped in. "Actually, that's brilliant. Someone should play that poor neglected piano. It's been sitting there all night looking sad." "But it's broken," Nina found herself saying, immediately regretting drawing more attention to herself. "Even better," Anton exclaimed, clapping his hands together. "A broken piano for our brave cleaning lady. Come on, everyone deserves their 3 minutes of fame." By now, their loud conversation had attracted attention from nearby guests. Nina saw Mrs. Rodriguez across the room, watching with a concerned expression. Mr. Peterson was deep in conversation with Vetrov and hadn't noticed the commotion. "Please," Nina said quietly, "I need to get back to work." "Just one song," Anton insisted, taking the tray from her hands and passing it to one of his friends. He took Nina's arm, not roughly but firmly enough that refusing would cause more of a scene. "I'll even give you a $100 tip. That's good money for playing a broken piano, right?" Nina felt trapped. People were watching now, at least 20 guests forming a loose semicircle around the piano. Some looked embarrassed by Anton's behavior. Others seemed amused. A few were just curious to see what would happen. "Leave her alone, Anton," said the woman in the jumpsuit again, more forcefully this time. "You've had too much to drink." "We're just having some fun, Zoe," Anton replied, waving dismissively. "Look, she doesn't mind." "Do you, miss?" "Nina," she said softly, her heart pounding in her chest. "See? Nina and I are becoming fast friends. Come on, Nina, just a quick song. Show us what you can do on our sad, broken piano. If you're really terrible, we'll still applaud. We're a very supportive crowd." More laughter rippled through the onlookers. Nina saw someone holding up a phone, possibly recording. Her face burned with humiliation. In all her years at the hotel, she'd never been singled out like this, never been made into a spectacle for guests' amusement. From across the room, Mr. Peterson finally noticed the situation and started moving toward them with a concerned expression. Nina caught his eye, silently pleading for rescue, but then something shifted inside her. A lifetime of being overlooked, of swallowing her pride, of hiding who she once was. It all bubbled up like water finally breaking through a dam. Why should she be embarrassed? She had nothing to be ashamed of. Anton was still talking, making some joke about how broken pianos and cleaning ladies were both underappreciated, but Nina wasn't listening anymore. She gently but firmly removed his hand from her arm. "One song," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. Anton looked surprised, then delighted. "She's going to do it," he announced to the crowd, stepping back with an exaggerated bow. "Ladies and gentlemen, I give you—" "Nina the cleaning lady!" Mr. Peterson had reached them now. "I'm sorry, sir, but our staff aren't part of the entertainment," he began, reaching for Nina's elbow. "It's okay," she said quietly, meeting his eyes with a calmness she didn't entirely feel. "Just one song." Mr. Peterson hesitated, clearly torn between stopping this potentially embarrassing situation and making an even bigger scene by dragging her away. "Nina," he warned in a low voice. "Please," she said. "One song." After a long moment, he stepped back with a slight nod, his expression making it clear that whatever happened next was on her head. Nina turned toward the piano, suddenly very conscious of her gray uniform with its coffee stain on the sleeve, her sensible shoes, her hair falling loose from its bun after a 12-hour shift. She was aware of the smirks, the phone's recording, the whispered comments. But as she approached the instrument, those distractions began to fade away. She sat down carefully on the bench, adjusting its height out of habit. The keys gleamed under the soft lighting, old friends waiting to be acknowledged. Nina placed her work-worn hands gently in her lap, took a deep breath, and closed her eyes for just a moment. When she opened them again, she was no longer Nina the cleaning lady. She was who she had been before everything changed, before she became invisible. Her fingers hovered over the keys as she decided what to play. The room fell strangely quiet as Nina's hands finally touched the keys. She began with a gentle press of middle C, testing, remembering. The note rang out clear and true. Not perfect perhaps, but alive. Like greeting an old friend after many years apart, there was a moment of hesitation, of reacquaintance. A few people in the crowd snickered, assuming her hesitation was uncertainty or lack of skill. Anton, the man who had put her in this position, leaned against a nearby column with a smug smile, phone raised to capture what he expected would be an amusing disaster. Nina closed her eyes briefly. In that moment of darkness, she was transported back to another time, another place, a concert hall with perfect acoustics, a flawlessly tuned grand piano, and an audience that had come specifically to hear her play. She had never been the most technically brilliant pianist at the conservatory, but her professors had always praised her emotional connection to the music. "You don't just play the notes," her favorite teacher had told her once. "You tell the story behind them." When she opened her eyes again, the Grand Hotel lounge came back into focus. The curious and mocking faces, the elegant surroundings, the imperfect piano. But something had shifted inside her. If this was to be her first public performance in 15 years, even as a joke at her expense, she would make it count. Nina's fingers began to move across the keys, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. She had chosen Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that had always felt like home to her. The opening notes floated into the air, delicate yet assured. A few of the keys stuck slightly, requiring a gentler touch than she would normally use. A handful of notes in the middle register were slightly out of tune, creating an unusual resonance. But Nina adjusted instinctively, the way a skilled sailor might compensate for changing winds. The piano's imperfections became part of her interpretation rather than obstacles to overcome. The first 30 seconds passed in what seemed like slow motion. The gentle melody unfolded like a flower opening at dawn, her left hand providing the steady pulse beneath. Nina was acutely aware of the shifting atmosphere in the room, the snickers dying away, replaced by a spreading silence as heads turned toward the piano. Anton's smug smile began to fade. He lowered his phone slightly, his eyebrows drawing together in confusion. This was not what he had expected. Near him, Zoe, the woman in the black jumpsuit, took a step closer to the piano, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand. Nina's right hand cascaded through a series of ornamental notes while her left maintained the nocturne's dreamy rhythm. The music grew slightly louder, more insistent, as if the melody were a question being asked with increasing urgency. Her body swayed slightly as she played, muscle memory returning despite the years of disuse. By the 1-minute mark, the room had gone completely still. Those who had been engaged in conversations at the edges of the lounge had fallen silent, turning to locate the source of the music. The waitstaff had paused in their duties, trays held motionless. Even Mr. Peterson stood frozen, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. Nina was only dimly aware of these reactions. She had entered that sacred space that exists between a musician and the music, a place where time stretches and contracts according to its own rules, where the physical world recedes and only the emotion remains. Her rough hands moved with unexpected grace, her plain face transformed by concentration and passion. As she reached the heart of the piece, Nina leaned into the emotional core of the music. The nocturne spoke of longing, of beauty tinged with sadness, of dreams that fade with the morning light but are no less precious for their impermanence. Her fingers coaxed this story from the keys, navigating around the piano's flaws with intuitive skill. Across the room, Alexander Vetrov had gone very still, his bushy eyebrows raised almost to his hairline. The composer set his drink down carefully on a nearby table and began to make his way through the crowd toward the piano. Moving with deliberate steps, his eyes never leaving Nina's hands. The faces watching her had undergone a remarkable transformation. The amusement and condescension had given way to something else entirely: surprise, wonder, and in some cases shame. Anton's phone was now hanging forgotten at his side, his expression one of stunned disbelief. A few of the professional musicians in the crowd exchanged glances, communicating wordlessly their recognition of genuine talent. One older violinist nodded slowly, eyes closed, letting the music wash over him. A music critic who had been about to leave the party had returned to the doorway, notebook suddenly in hand. Nina's fingers danced through the more complex middle section of the nocturne, where the harmonies grow richer and the emotional landscape more complex. A particularly problematic key stuck for a moment, but she adjusted seamlessly, turning what could have been an awkward pause into an artistic choice, a breath, a moment of contemplation before continuing the musical journey. Some members of the audience had tears forming in their eyes, though they could not have explained exactly why. Perhaps it was the contrast between the humble cleaner and the transcendent music she created. Perhaps it was the recognition of beauty hidden in plain sight, of value overlooked and dismissed. Or perhaps it was simply the music itself, Chopin's ability to speak directly to the heart, amplified by Nina's sincere and unaffected interpretation. As the piece approached its conclusion, returning to the gentler mood of the opening but now infused with all that had come before, Nina felt a curious lightness spreading through her body. The years of silence, of denying who she truly was, seemed to lift away with each note. She was not playing for the audience or even for herself. She was playing for the music, giving it voice as she had been trained to do long ago. The final notes hung in the air like the last stars before dawn, resonating in the perfect acoustics of the lounge before fading into a silence so complete you could hear the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the far corner. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. Then the spell broke. The room erupted in spontaneous, thunderous applause. People who had been sitting jumped to their feet. Those already standing moved closer to the piano as if drawn by an invisible force. Voices called out in approval. "Bravo! Incredible! My God!" Nina remained seated, momentarily unable to move. The sound of applause, so familiar once, so long absent from her life, washed over her like a warm wave. Her hands trembled slightly as she finally lowered them to her lap. Anton pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his earlier smugness replaced by genuine amazement and something that might have been respect. "That was... How did you..." For once he seemed at a loss for words. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Zoe asked, her voice hushed with awe. Before Nina could answer, the crowd parted like the Red Sea as Alexander Vetrov made his way to the piano. The room quieted again as the celebrated composer stood before the cleaning lady, studying her with intense, intelligent eyes. "Your name," he said. It wasn't a question, but a command. "Nina," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nina Petrov." Vetrov's eyes widened, a flash of recognition crossing his face. "Nina Petrov," he repeated slowly. "From the Kiev Conservatory?" "The Nina Petrov who won the Eastern European Young Artist Competition in 2005. Nina nodded, unable to speak past the sudden lump in her throat. No one had connected her to that past life in so long. No one had remembered. "I was one of the judges," Vetrov said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "I gave you the highest score of any pianist that year. Your Rachmaninoff was exceptional. Murmurs spread through the crowd as people began to whisper to one another. The hotel manager, Mr. Peterson, pushed his way forward, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. You were a concert pianist? He asked Nina, looking as if his entire understanding of the world had been upended. Once, she said quietly. A long time ago. Not so long, Vetrov corrected. And not were. Are. You are a pianist, Miss Petrov. The hands may clean, but the soul still plays. He turned to address the now captivated crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been privileged tonight. This woman was one of the most promising talents of her generation before the political situation in her country forced many artists to flee. Nina felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back, unwilling to break down in front of all these people. But something was cracking inside her, a wall she had built years ago to protect herself from the pain of what she had lost. Would you play something else for us? Vetrov asked, but his tone made it clear this was not a request from a hotel guest to a member of the cleaning staff. This was one musician asking another to share their gift. Nina looked around at the sea of faces, some she recognized from years of cleaning around them, never truly seen. Others were strangers who had come for Vetrov's celebration. All were watching her with new eyes, seeing her for perhaps the first time. The piano is not in the best condition, she said hesitantly. Vetrov smiled, his bushy eyebrows lifting. Neither are most of us, he replied, gesturing to himself in the crowd. But we still have music to make, do we not? A ripple of appreciative laughter moved through the audience. Nina felt a smile, a real smile, not the polite one she offered to guests who bothered to acknowledge her, spread across her face. She turned back to the keys. No longer the invisible cleaning lady, but Nina Petrov. Pianist ready to play again. Nina turned back to the piano, aware that everything had changed in the span of a single piece of music. The crowd waited with hushed anticipation. No longer party guests watching a cleaning lady perform a parlor trick, but an audience expecting artistry from a recognized musician. She closed her eyes briefly, considering what to play next. The broken piano would struggle with anything too technically demanding. She needed to choose something that would work within its limitations, while still showcasing what she could do. The answer came to her suddenly: Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, first movement. Its haunting melody and relatively gentle technical requirements would suit both the instrument and the mood of the room. Without announcement, Nina's fingers found the opening notes, the famous triplet pattern emerging like gentle raindrops. The hushed, contemplative beginning silenced even the few whispered conversations in the corners of the room. Several guests found seats or leaned against walls, settling in to listen properly. A waiter quietly began dimming some of the brighter lights, creating a more intimate atmosphere without being asked. As Nina played, memories flowed through her like a river that had long been dammed but now ran free again. She remembered her tiny apartment in Kiev, where she had practiced on an upright piano with yellowed keys until her neighbors complained. She remembered her first recital at age 7, the terror and exhilaration of walking onto a stage. She remembered the crushing disappointment when her family couldn't afford to send her to a special music school, and the determined joy when she won her first scholarship years later. The steady pulse of the sonata's bass notes anchored these floating memories, giving structure to emotions she had locked away for survival's sake. The music built gradually, not with volume but with intensity, the melody growing more insistent against the hypnotic triplet pattern. In the front row, Vetrov stood with his eyes closed, one hand conducting small, subtle movements in time with her playing. The critic who had been taking notes had stopped writing entirely, his pen hovering motionless above his notebook. Anton, the man who had started all this by mocking her, stood with his arms crossed, head slightly bowed, perhaps in respect, perhaps in shame. Across the room, Nina spotted Mrs. Rodriguez watching from the doorway. Her normally stern face softened with something like wonder. Beside her, several other cleaning staff had gathered, abandoning their posts to witness their co-workers' transformation. Their expressions ranged from confusion to pride to outright disbelief. As she approached the end of the movement, Nina felt a strange sense of peace washing over her. Whatever happened after tonight, whether she returned to cleaning floors tomorrow or not, she had reclaimed a part of herself that had been lost. She had remembered who she was beneath the gray uniform and the invisible existence. The final triplets faded away like a whisper, And again the room held its breath before erupting into applause even more enthusiastic than before. Petrov stepped forward, taking Nina's hand and helping her to her feet. He raised their joined hands as if they were fellow performers taking a bow after a concert. The gesture nearly undid her, this small recognition of equality from a man whose compositions were played by orchestras around the world. "Ladies and gentlemen," Petrov's voice boomed over the applause, "we have witnessed something extraordinary tonight. Music has a way of finding its voice, even in unexpected places." He turned to Nina. "You have honored my birthday celebration in a way I could never have anticipated." Nina found her voice, though it trembled slightly. "The honor was mine, Maestro Petrov." The crowd began to press closer, faces now eager and curious rather than dismissive. Questions came from all directions. "Where did you study? How long have you been working here? Do you teach? Why aren't you performing professionally?" Before Nina could answer any of them, Mr. Peterson stepped in, his hotel manager instincts kicking in despite his obvious shock. "Ladies and gentlemen, please give Ms. Petrov some space. This has been quite unexpected for all of us." Nina gave him a grateful look. The attention was overwhelming after so many years of being deliberately unnoticed. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from playing, but from the emotional tidal wave crashing through her. "Perhaps we could all use a moment," Petrov suggested, sensing her discomfort. "And perhaps," he added with a meaningful look at the bartender, "Ms. Petrov would like a glass of champagne? I believe she is off duty now." The bartender hurried to comply, pouring a flute of champagne and bringing it to Nina with a respectful nod. She accepted it with a bemused smile, the cool glass strange in her hand after years of holding cleaning supplies. As the crowd reluctantly gave her some breathing room, breaking back into smaller conversation groups, though most still stole glances in her direction, Zoe approached with Anton trailing behind her. "I owe you an apology," Anton said, looking genuinely contrite. "What I did was cruel and condescending. I had no idea." "Few people do," Nina interrupted gently. "That's often the point of being a cleaner, to go unnoticed." "Still," Anton insisted, "I'm sorry, and thank you for playing. It was beautiful." Nina nodded her acceptance of his apology, too emotionally drained to hold any grudge. Zoe stepped forward then, her expression intense. "I'm with Harmony Records," she said without preamble. "We specialize in classical and jazz recordings. I'd like to talk to you about possibly recording some pieces. Nothing major to start. Perhaps an EP of nocturnes or something similar that would showcase your interpretive skills." Nina blinked in surprise. "Recording? I haven't played seriously in 15 years. Tonight was magical," Zoe finished for her, "and exactly the kind of authentic musical experience that's too rare these days." She pressed a business card into Nina's hand. "Think about it. Call me next week if you're interested." Before Nina could respond, Petrov returned with a small group of people he introduced as fellow composers and musicians. They spoke to her as a colleague, asking about her training, her interpretations, her experience. No one mentioned her job as a cleaner. It was as if that part of her identity had been temporarily erased by the music she had created. After 20 minutes of conversation, Nina excused herself, feeling suddenly overwhelmed. She slipped away to the service corridor, needing a moment alone to process everything that had happened. She leaned against the wall, the coolness of the concrete a stark contrast to the warmth of the lounge and its occupants. Mrs. Rodriguez found her there, holding out a glass of water. "Drink this," she said in her usual no-nonsense tone, though her eyes were softer than Nina had ever seen them. "You look like you might faint." Nina accepted the water gratefully. "I'm sorry for abandoning my post," she said automatically. Mrs. Rodriguez waved away the apology. "I think you're excused just this once." She hesitated, then added, "My father played violin. Not professionally, he was a factory worker. But he could make that instrument sing like an angel. He always said music was in the hands, not in the job title." It was the most personal thing Mrs. Rodriguez had ever shared with her. Nina felt tears threatening again. "Thank you," she whispered. "Mr. Peterson wants to see you in his office," Mrs. Rodriguez continued, back to business. "When you're ready." Nina nodded, taking a deep breath. "I'll go now." Mr. Peterson was sitting behind his desk when Nina entered his office, his expression unreadable. He gestured for her to sit in the chair across from him. 15 years. he said after a long moment. You've worked here for 15 years and not once did you mention you were a concert pianist. Former concert pianist, Nina corrected gently. And it wasn't relevant to cleaning floors. Mr. Peterson's face tightened. Not relevant? Nina, we have events here all the time that feature live music. We hire pianists at considerable expense for our Sunday brunches. We've been paying for piano tuning and maintenance for an instrument that rarely gets used properly. I needed the job, Nina said simply. Not occasionally playing at brunches, a steady job with health insurance for my mother's sake. Something in Mr. Peterson's expression shifted. Your mother, she's ill? Nina nodded. Parkinson's, it's why we came here. The treatments are better. Mr. Peterson was silent for a moment, processing this information. Then he leaned forward. I'd like to make you an offer. The hotel has been considering adding more live music to our events. We could use someone with your talent, not as a cleaner, but as our resident pianist. Nina stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Resident pianist? 4 nights a week in the lounge, special events as needed. We'd work around your mother's care schedule, of course. He named a salary that was nearly double what she earned as a cleaner, and you'd keep all your benefits. Nina's mind raced. To play again regularly, professionally, to be seen and heard rather than invisible, to earn enough that she might finally move her mother to a better apartment, perhaps even afford some additional care help. The piano would need to be properly repaired, she said, surprising herself with the negotiation. Mr. Peterson smiled for the first time, already planning to call the specialist on Monday. Fetrov himself recommended someone. I'd need time to practice to rebuild my repertoire and my stamina, Nina added. We can start you in 2 weeks. Gives us time to fix the piano and for you to prepare. He extended his hand across the desk. Do we have a deal, Ms. Petrov? Nina looked at his outstretched hand. Just hours ago, this same man had barely acknowledged her existence as she cleaned around him. Now he was offering her a chance to reclaim her identity as a musician. Life could change so quickly. Sometimes all it took was the courage to sit down at a broken piano and play. She took his hand and shook it firmly. We have a deal, Mr. Peterson. As she left his office and walked back toward the lounge where the party continued, Nina felt as though she were walking into a new life, one where the music she had kept silent for so long would finally be heard again. 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity and emotion for Nina. The morning after the party, she had arrived at work at her usual time, 5:15 a.m., only to be met by Mr. Peterson himself, something that had never happened before. He had gently taken her cleaning cart from her hands, explaining that she was being reassigned, effective immediately. But who will clean the lounge? Had been her first question, thinking of the practical matters rather than herself. We have other staff, Mr. Peterson had said with a smile. Your job now is to prepare for your debut as the Grand Hotel's resident pianist. It felt surreal, like a dream she might wake from at any moment. But as days passed and the dream didn't end, Nina began to accept that her life had truly changed overnight. The piano tuner arrived from Vienna on Tuesday, a serious young man with careful hands who spent 2 full days restoring the Steinway to its proper glory. Nina sat nearby watching the meticulous work, occasionally testing a note or a passage when invited to do so. By Wednesday evening, the instrument sang again with its full voice. Its previous limitations healed by expert care. The hammers were worn, several strings needed replacing, and the action was sluggish, the tuner explained as he closed up his tools. But the heart of this piano is strong. Sometimes the finest instruments are simply waiting for the right hands to bring them back to life. Nina thought there was a metaphor in his words that applied to her as well. At home, things were changing too. Nina had sat with her mother the morning after the party, holding her trembling hands as she explained what had happened and what it would mean for them. They want me to play again. Mama, professionally. Her mother's eyes had filled with tears. I always prayed for this, she had whispered in their native language. Every night I asked God to give you back your music. But I worry about you, Nina had confessed. My schedule will be different, evenings instead of days. I won't be here as much. Her mother had squeezed her hands with surprising strength. I took you away from music once when we had to leave everything behind. I won't let you sacrifice it again, not for me. By the end of the first week, Nina had arranged for a part-time caregiver to stay with her mother on the evenings she would be playing. The extra income from her new position made this possible, easing one of her biggest concerns. The second change came when Zoe from Harmony Records called, just as she had promised she would. "I've been thinking about your sound," she said without preamble when Nina answered the phone. "There's something honest about your playing. No flashy tricks or exaggerated emotions, just pure connection to the music. I'd like to record you playing some nocturnes, Chopin, Field, maybe some lesser-known composers. Nothing complicated, just you and the piano." They had arranged to meet the following week to discuss details. Nina had hung up the phone feeling dizzy with possibility. A recording, her playing preserved and shared with others beyond the hotel lounge. It was more than she had dared to hope for, but the most profound changes were happening within Nina herself. Years of holding her body in the submissive posture expected of cleaning staff, eyes down, shoulders slightly hunched, trying to be invisible, had taken a physical toll. Now she found herself standing straighter, meeting people's eyes, speaking with more confidence. She practiced for hours each day on the hotel's piano, her fingers gradually remembering their strength and agility. The calluses from years of scrubbing began to soften as her hands returned to their former work. She felt muscles awakening in her back, her shoulders, her forearms, musician's muscles, different from those used for lifting buckets and pushing carts. Tonight was to be her first official performance as the Grand Hotel's resident pianist. Mr. Peterson had placed a small, elegant sign in the lobby announcing Nina Petrov, piano, evenings from 7 to 10 p.m., and had mentioned her in the hotel's newsletter to regular guests. Word had spread quickly about the cleaning lady turned pianist, and the lounge was expected to be busier than usual. Nina arrived early, her heart pounding with familiar pre-performance nerves she hadn't felt in years. She wore a simple black dress, not extravagant, but worlds away from her gray cleaning uniform. Her hair was styled simply but elegantly, and she wore a touch of makeup, something she had rarely bothered with as a cleaner, when it would only be sweated away during her physical work. As she stepped into the lounge, several of the hotel staff were there waiting for her. Mrs. Rodriguez, Tom the security guard, Delia from the breakfast service, and even a few of the housekeeping staff who had been her colleagues just weeks before. They broke into spontaneous applause when they saw her. "We wanted to wish you luck," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her usual gruffness softened by genuine warmth, "and to say we're proud of you." Nina felt tears threatening to spill. These people had worked alongside her for years, sharing the invisible world of service work. Their recognition meant as much to her as any critic's approval. "Thank you," she managed, accepting their hugs and well wishes before they had to return to their duties. As 7 o'clock approached, the lounge began filling with hotel guests. Nina recognized some as regulars, others as new faces perhaps drawn by the story they had heard. Her nervousness increased when she spotted Anton and 2 others from Vetrov's party sitting in a corner, raising their glasses in a silent toast when they caught her eye. But the real surprise came just minutes before she was due to begin playing. The lounge doors opened and in walked Alexander Vetrov himself, accompanied by an elegant older woman and 2 younger men, Nina recognized as acclaimed musicians from the city's symphony orchestra. Vetrov approached her with a warm smile. "I hope you don't mind us dropping in," he said. "I wanted my wife to hear you play, and these gentlemen," he gestured to the 2 musicians, "are always interested in discovering new talent for their chamber music series." Nina's mouth went dry. "I'm honored, Maestro Vetrov, but this is just hotel lounge music. Light classical pieces, some jazz standards." "Music is music," Vetrov said dismissively. "Bach wrote for church services, Mozart for dinner parties. The setting doesn't diminish the art." He patted her hand. "Play whatever is on your program. We are here as guests, not critics." With that, he led his party to a table near the piano, ordered drinks, and settled in as if he were at any ordinary hotel lounge and not about to hear a former cleaning lady play. At exactly 7, Nina took her seat at the piano. The lounge had fallen quiet, all eyes on her. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her. Too many expectations, too much attention after years of invisibility. But then she placed her hands on the keys, felt their cool, familiar texture beneath her fingers, and everything else faded away. She began with a piece she knew intimately, Debussy's Clair de Lune, its dreamy, impressionistic quality, perfect for setting the mood of the evening. As she played, the nervousness melted away, replaced by the pure joy of creating music again. From her position at the piano, Nina could see the entire lounge. Hotel guests paused in their conversations to listen. Waiters moved more slowly, more gracefully, as if matching their pace to the music. Through the open doors to the lobby, she noticed people stopping, listening for a moment before continuing on their way. Even the night manager, a man who rarely showed emotion, stood in the doorway with a look of quiet appreciation on his face. As Nina transitioned to her second piece, she caught sight of an unexpected figure in the back of the lounge. Her mother, seated in her wheelchair, accompanied by her caregiver. Nina almost stumbled over a note in surprise. They had arranged for her mother to attend her first weekend performance, not this quiet weekday debut. Yet here she was, her face glowing with pride, her trembling hands clasped together as she watched her daughter reclaim her gift. In that moment, everything came full circle for Nina. The long journey from her homeland, the years of struggle and sacrifice, the hidden talents and forgotten dreams, all had led to this moment of reconnection with her true self. Over the next 3 hours, Nina played a mixture of classical pieces, gentle jazz standards, and a few folk melodies from her homeland. She lost herself in the music, barely noticing as guests came and went. Vetrov and his party stayed for over an hour, the composer occasionally nodding in approval or whispering something to his companions. When 10 o'clock came, Nina played a final piece, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the same one that had changed her life 2 weeks earlier. As the last notes faded, the lounge burst into enthusiastic applause. Several guests approached to express their appreciation, some asking if she would be playing again tomorrow. She would. Others wondering if she had recordings available. Soon, she told them, thinking of Zoe's offer. After the lounge had emptied, Nina went to her mother kneeling beside her wheelchair. "You should be home resting," she gently scolded in their native language. "I couldn't miss your first night," her mother replied, cupping Nina's cheek with a trembling hand. "My little girl playing in a grand hotel. Your father would have been so proud." Nina helped her mother and the caregiver into a taxi the hotel had arranged, promising to be home soon. As she turned back toward the entrance, she found Mr. Peterson waiting for her. "A triumph," he said simply. "The lounge has never been so full on a Wednesday. And to have Alexander Vetrov as a regular guest, the publicity alone is priceless." Nina smiled, too tired for many words, but filled with a deep contentment. "Thank you for taking a chance on me." "No," Mr. Peterson replied thoughtfully. "Thank you for taking a chance on us. It can't have been easy, sitting down at that piano when everyone expected you to fail." Nina thought about that moment 2 weeks ago, when a cruel joke had opened the door to her past and her future simultaneously. "Sometimes," she said, "the hardest step is just allowing yourself to be seen." As she walked home through the quiet streets that night, Nina felt a sense of rightness that had been missing from her life for far too long. She was no longer invisible, no longer just the woman who cleaned while others lived their lives. She had reclaimed her voice, her gift, her identity. Tomorrow she would practice new pieces for her growing repertoire. Next week she would meet with Zoe about the recording. Next month perhaps she would look for a better apartment for herself and her mother. The future stretched before her, full of possibilities that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. All because she had found the courage to sit down at a broken piano when others expected her to fail, and instead had revealed the music that had been inside her all along.